We've also done a significant amount of work, but more to do, on developing clinical content behind creating a better clinical decision system for our own health, particularly Birmingham Own Health and our own health workers in Nottingham. And we perhaps were limited in the past by our work with Pfizer in terms of their development of the system, but we have done more developmental work with both Pfizer and for our Nottingham Own Health staff in preparing a decision support system that's more aligned to the work we've done in our core service. We've also done a significant amount of statutory mandatory training with those staff groups, and that's important because they now are both in line with our own staff in other parts of the service, but we are also able to monitor their statutory mandatory training uptake. And I guess the last point, which is important because it links to conversations we had at service review, was that we've introduced a post-discharge patient outcome survey, which takes place a year after the patients have left the programme, to start the journey of collecting clinical data and outcome-based data to see how effective the service has actually been. So there is a whole action plan behind those points I've made, but those are the main headlines in terms of the areas of development and improvement that we've sought to make for the Own Health Service as a whole as we move forward. So thank you, Chair.
It's an impressive list, Helen.
Yep.
I wonder if we can just sort of hold those ideas and just hear from anyone who's listened to the call who had any particular impressions, thoughts, reactions to that call that we all heard, most of us heard.
I don't mind starting.
Yeah, go on, Peter. Brave man.
Well, to me it sounded like a couple of really sort of old friends having a chat about life, the universe and everything, to be honest. And jolly nice it was. I would have enjoyed the conversation and would have felt probably reasonably good at the end of it, with the exception of the fact that I felt if I was the customer, I'd have sort of gone up and down a bit with this conversation in terms of my health, because I think I'd have come out of it feeling that I had more wrong with me at the end of it than I started with, simply because I got the symptoms quoted to me for a number of things, and particularly the angina one, which actually, if I had a twinge in my right toe, it probably would have been angina. So I mean, so to that extent, I felt that I could have been confused given the sort of type of person that's being talked to, which was an older female. It was so to the extent that I feel it was confusing, and at the end it did come round to a plan at the end, a conclusion, but it had gone through so many iterations, including taking aspirin, which I wasn't quite sure was how appropriate that was actually in the circumstances. But so it was a good social conversation. It had some clinical content, but drifted considerably into areas which I wasn't convinced needed to be developed as much as it was. And at the end, where I summed it up for me, because I wrote down very chatty, socially interesting, Christmas parties and arrangements were discussed like two old friends who were having a cup of tea.
Okay.
So there we are.
Sue.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yes, because I heard that, but I also heard something else. And I agree that it went on a little bit too long. But actually, what I also heard was a very subtle conversation, which actually covered some really important parts of the care management process, the pain clinic, the osteoporosis, all of those elements, the angina, but delivered in a way that was absolutely appropriate to the patient, because the patient was clearly uncomfortable with disturbing the GP or disturbing the nurse or disturbing, and actually, whilst it might have sounded just a little bit of a chat. There was a lot of stuff underneath it that actually I thought was very positive. And what struck me was how very different that conversation was to our core service, which is actually generally dealing with a symptomatic issue. This was about building trust and relationship, and every month ringing back this patient and making sure that the elements of the care package were being dealt with. So I think I heard a more positive not arguing that it couldn't have been tightened up and actually could have been moved on a little bit more quickly. But I think if they picked the phone up and said, have you done this, this, this and this, the conversation wouldn't have continued.
Okay, let's hold that thought, because I definitely want to comment on that. But I'm inviting Tim to make a contribution.
I must say, I think I heard a conversation rather close to Peter's review. I think the thing that troubled me about it, apart from the fact that a number of disease processes were mentioned which probably didn't apply and may have caused anxiety, was that I was absolutely not convinced at the end of the conversation that beyond their Christmas arrangements the patient had taken anything very much from it. There was no confirmation from the patient about what the patient was going to do next, or what the patient might be doing differently, or indeed anything. As far as I heard, that may have been in there, and as I say, Sue had a slightly different conversation, different emphasis, that perhaps I was so taken with the pleasant conversation aspect that I didn't pick up the specifics. And I as a clinician, I wouldn't have been terribly comfortable leaving that conversation in the way it was left, particularly if you're not then going to talk to the patient for another month.
Okay.
If that's the clinical scenario.
Sue, do you want to come back?
Can I just come back on that one thing? Because right at the end, it was clear she was going to go to the GP the next day, and the nurse had made an appointment to call her back at 6 o'clock on the Monday.
Right.
So actually I thought there were some very clear steps that the patient who wouldn't have gone to the GP prior to that, but actually decided was going to go, and there was a time set and a follow-up appointment.
So do we know then that she did?
Well, that's a question I would have liked to have known, but I thought
yes.
It did move it to a conclusion.
My feeling, I guess,
Yeah.
was that I wasn't sure the patient was going to be doing anything beyond perhaps looking forward to the next call, which I'm sure she would be doing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to say something, but I'll let Nick come in first. Jimmy, you also.
Yes, please.
Different aspect, really. I was struck by the fact that the nurse that was calling had no information about what had happened to the patient. There was no kind of data feed that enabled the nurse to know what had happened to the patient, and part of the conversation was obviously finding out from the patient what had happened since the last call. And that's just an observation. It's not necessarily the one I would expect it to be in place now, but it does emphasise the fact that the service exists outside of the rest of the health system. But having said that, a hospital would not know whether a patient had been in touch with their community team or vice versa quite often. The other was that, yes, the nurse was effectively making referrals, but there was no information going from the service to the GP practice, for example, to say, I've had this conversation and. So it struck me that there were no data type links, information links to and from the rest of the NHS.
Okay, Tim?
Thank you. Yeah, I had mixtures of what Peter felt and what Sue felt. And I was thinking either this is really subtle or it's going on too long, and I didn't reach a conclusion. But I think that either she had to go. The bit that worried me was, and I'll stand to be corrected, if she needed to go and see a GP and she didn't, and we didn't have the call till Monday, was that a very satisfactory answer? I'd worry about that. If she had to go and see a GP fairly rapidly, then a follow-up call to make sure that she did do that couldn't have waited till Monday, because I don't know what day of the week we were having the call, but anyway, so I think it was a Wednesday or Thursday, so that worried me a little bit, because an outcome could easily have been didn't go to the GP and waited for the call for Monday, and if it was urgent, then it wouldn't have happened. The other thing is that I took away also is the patient actually said, "This is the only time that anyone's been interested in me," which I felt was really strong, actually.
Yeah, I did too.
That was really quite worrying, and I'm not sure what we do with that bit of information. But this lady, she said of date of birth, she was 78. She obviously had a range of conditions, and so it's quite a difficult call, actually. But to say that this is the only time that anyone's taking interest in me says there's something going wrong somewhere else, actually. And I'm not sure what we do with that. I think that would be quite an important message for her surgery to know. Still.
So that's very interesting. I think just to coming out of the chair for a moment to play back what I felt and then thought about the call. So it was over 20 minutes long, and as I listened to it, I felt I felt as though it was like watching paint dry, and that there wasn't nearly enough content, and there wasn't a sense of direction, and it meandered, and I was completely unclear. And I asked myself the question: is this just because I am, obsessively outcome focused and driven? So I was exactly doing the same as Tim, and asking myself, well, is it just my personal reaction? And had I been on the phone, would the conversation have been different? Was there something subtle? And I wasn't sure. And so the question, so that made me think further about what we know. What we're trying to do is to understand whether these sorts of services deliver value and how they deliver value and how to improve them. So what I want to understand is what's our organisational view. So I was a complete amateur and novice. I've listened to Birmingham Own Health calls before, but in reality I'm a novice at this. What is good? What works? I don't know. What's our organisational view about what is a good call? And I'm glad to hear the things that Helen talked about, first of all, but it worries me that we've been delivering this service for how many years? And
4 years.
3.
And that these things haven't been sort of pinned down before. The questions I would then like to ask are, what is the average call length for Birmingham Own Health or any own health service? And what's the variation in call length? Is it that individual practitioners have the same range, they have some short calls and some long calls, or is it practitioner driven, is it patient driven, and what do we think a good call is like, and how does that average call length change during the life of a patient on the service? Does it get shorter? Because I think in order to deliver these sorts of services effectively, we know that these kinds of complex interventions are very, very difficult to evaluate. It's very difficult to know, even if it's effective, which elements are effective and why. So what kind of analysis do we do about the bit that we do have data on, things like length of call and content of call, that helps us understand what's good about the service and how it can be better?